My name is Naomi Whitfield, and for 28 years, I was the invisible daughter. I packed my life into 3 taped-up boxes, the way you do when you're trying to leave a crime scene. Quietly, quickly, and with your heart in your throat. I didn't want a confrontation. I just wanted out of the house my family had claimed as their own, the moment my grandmother's heart stopped beating. I was standing on the sidewalk outside a crumbling one-room apartment, clutching my last bag when my phone vibrated. It was a notification that would change the trajectory of my life. My younger sister, Lydia, the math prodigy my parents worshipped, had posted a photo. It was me, captured from the upstairs window as I walked away, looking small and defeated. The caption was a final public execution of my dignity. Finally, the freeloader is gone, back to the gutter where she belongs. At first, the cruelty was so sharp I couldn't breathe. Then I saw the numbers. 1,450 likes. 1,000 people celebrating my homelessness, like it was a victory for the family. My mother, Patricia, had shared the post with a heart emoji, and my father, Harold, had liked a comment calling me a burden finally lifted. I didn't reply. I didn't defend the secret sales work I'd been doing at night, or the meager savings I'd scraped together to afford this tiny, damp room. Instead, I did something that would have looked like total surrender. I liked every single hateful comment. I needed them to feel like they had won. I needed them to believe I was truly gone and powerless. Then I put my phone down and disappeared into the shadows of my new life. For 3 months, the silence was absolute. I watched from a distance as they posted photos of themselves drinking expensive wine on my late grandmother's patio, treating her estate like a trophy they'd won. They thought they were the masters of the world. Then, last Tuesday, the silence didn't just break, it shattered. My phone lit up like a fire alarm. 52 missed calls, 37 frantic texts, voice notes filled with a kind of panic I'd never heard from them before. My mother was sobbing. Lydia was screaming. They weren't calling to apologize for the Facebook post. They were calling because their entire world had just collapsed. And for some reason they couldn't comprehend, I was the only person who held the power to save them. To understand how they went from celebrating my exit to begging for my help, you have to understand the truth about that house. My grandmother, Eleanor, was the only one who truly looked at me. She was a woman of few words, but she had spent the last several years, the years she was sick, watching us all. She watched Lydia roll her eyes at the smell of ointment. She watched my father calculate the square footage of her living room while she was still sitting in it. And she watched me. She watched me massage her legs every single day, cook the only meals she could stomach, and hold her hand during every terrifying hospital appointment. I didn't do any of it for a house. In fact, when I moved into that one-room apartment, I thought I had lost everything. I had no idea that while I was being the help, Eleanor was quietly judging our character and making a decision that would turn my family's victory into their greatest nightmare. The truth started with a knock on my door from a lawyer I'd never met, and it ended with a decision that would prove, once and for all, who the unintelligent sister really was. To see how a failure ended up with the keys to a $589,000 empire, you have to see what happened next. The smell of eucalyptus and menthol always reminds me of the truth. It was the scent of my grandmother's bedroom, a space my parents treated like a restricted zone, and my sister treated like a chore. For the last 3 years of Eleanor's life, that set was my world. Every morning, before the rest of the house even stirred, I would walk the 2 blocks from our rented family home to Eleanor's estate. I didn't go there because I had nothing else to do. I went there because I was the only one who realized that behind the high ceilings and the mahogany furniture, a woman was fading away in silence. I remember one Tuesday vividly. Eleanor's legs were swollen, the skin stretched thin like parchment paper. I was on my knees, gently rubbing a thick, medicinal ointment into her ankles. It was a slow, repetitive process, but it was the only thing that brought her relief. Suddenly, the door swung open. Lydia stood there, her nose wrinkled in immediate disgust. She was holding a mock exam paper, her eyes shining with the arrogance that only a straight-A student possesses. "Ah, it smells like a pharmacy in here," Lydia groaned, waving a hand in front of her face. She didn't look at Eleanor. She didn't ask how she was feeling. She looked at me with a smirk. Still playing nurse, Naomi? It's a bit pathetic, don't you think? Maybe if you put this much effort into a textbook, Mom wouldn't have to apologize for your grades at every dinner party. Eleanor's hand, frail and trembling, tightened on my shoulder. She didn't say a word, but I felt the weight of her gaze. She was watching Lydia, watching the way her own granddaughter recoiled from the reality of her aging body. I have a math competition this weekend, Lydia continued, directed at the room in general. Dad says if I win, he's going to start scouting which room in this house will be my new study once we finally move in. This place is wasted on just one person. The callousness of it made my stomach turn. My father, Harold, was already measuring the drapes while the owner was still breathing. Later that afternoon, when I drove Eleanor to the hospital for her oncology appointment, the silence in the car was heavy. My parents hadn't even offered to drive. Patricia was busy celebrating Lydia's latest certificate, and Harold was too stressed with work to sit in a waiting room. As I helped Eleanor into her wheelchair at the clinic, she finally spoke. Her voice was a dry rasp, but her eyes were as sharp as diamonds. They see walls and square footage, Naomi, she whispered, her hand gripping mine with surprising strength. They see an inheritance. But you see me. At the time, I thought she was just being sentimental. I thought her gratitude was my only reward. I had no idea that while I was carefully organizing her pill dispensers and tracking her heart rate, Eleanor was doing some bookkeeping of her own. She was calculating the cost of a family that only loved when it was convenient. As we left the hospital that day, I saw a black sedan parked near the entrance. A man in a sharp suit was watching us. A man I would later recognize as Eleanor's attorney. But back then, I just tucked the medical records into my bag and focused on getting my grandmother home. I didn't know that the invisible work I was doing was being recorded in a ledger far more important than any of Lydia's math books. And I certainly didn't know that my family's plan to move in was about to hit a wall they never saw coming. But the move-in did happen, and that was when the real nightmare began. The silence following a death is supposed to be sacred. It's meant for reflection, for the heavy, hollow ache of loss. But in Eleanor's house, the silence didn't even last until the sun went down. My grandmother had been gone for less than 6 hours, and the air in the estate didn't smell like mourning. It smelled like a hostile takeover. I was sitting on the edge of the velvet armchair in the parlor, my eyes burning from the tears I'd shed alone in the hospital hallway. I still had her hospital wristband in my pocket. But my parents and Lydia, they were already busy. The master suite has the south-facing windows, my mother Patricia said, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She wasn't whispering. She was walking from room to room with a measuring tape she'd pulled from her purse. It'll need new wallpaper, obviously. Something more modern. Eleanor's taste was always so suffocating. I get the library, Lydia announced, her voice sharp and eager. She was dragging a suitcase across the hardwood floors, a suitcase she'd packed before we even got the call from the hospice nurse. It has the best natural light for my study sessions, and besides, I need a space that reflects my IQ, not a dusty room filled with old romance novels. I watched them from the doorway, feeling like a ghost in a house I no longer recognized. My father, Harold, was in the dining room, running his fingers over the edge of the antique mahogany table. He wasn't crying. He was squinting at the underside of the chairs, looking for a manufacturer's mark. "Do you think we can get the deed transferred before the funeral?" Lydia asked, turning to our father. "I want to update my location on Facebook. Living in a rental is so low tier. I want everyone to see the Whitfield estate as my backdrop." "Don't worry, honey," Harold said, his voice smooth and opportunistic. "The lawyer should be calling any day. Your grandmother knew I was the only one capable of managing an asset this size. It's a formality." The callousness was a physical blow. They hadn't even chosen a casket yet, but they had already divided the spoils. They were vultures, circling a life that hadn't even been laid to rest. When I tried to speak to suggest we at least wait until after the service to move their boxes in, my mother didn't even turn around. "Naomi, dear, don't be difficult," she said, flicking a piece of lint off a curtain that didn't belong to her. "We're finally out of that cramped rental. You should be grateful. You can have the small room over the garage. It's quiet, which is perfect for your little drawings." Lydia let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Actually, Mom, that room would be better for my extra textbooks. Naomi can just stay in the basement. It's not like she contributes to the bills." I looked at my sister, the prodigy, who couldn't calculate the value of human decency if her life depended on it. She was already on her phone, typing out a status update about her new chapter in her new mansion. I retreated to the kitchen, the only room that still felt like Eleanor. I realized then that my grief was an inconvenience to them. I was a guest in their new kingdom, a servant who had outlived her usefulness now that ointment didn't need rubbing and the drugs didn't need dosing. As I stood there, the doorbell rang. It was a delivery, not flowers for a funeral, but a new desk Lydia had ordered 3 days ago. She had timed the delivery for the day she expected Eleanor to pass. I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. They were so certain. They were so proud. But as I watched my father sign for the delivery, I noticed a black envelope stuck to the bottom of the mail stack. It was addressed to me. I reached for it, but Lydia snatched it away before I could see the return address. She didn't know that the paper in her hand was the first fuse on a bomb that was about to blow her mansion to pieces. The transition from daughter to intruder happened faster than the ink could dry on my grandmother's death certificate. Within a week of moving into Eleanor's estate, my family had turned the sanctuary I had spent years protecting into a fortress of hostility. Dinner was the worst. It was a nightly ritual of humiliation. I would sit at the far end of the long mahogany table, the same table where I used to feed Eleanor soup, while Lydia held court. "I've decided to turn the sunroom into a yoga studio," Lydia announced, poking at her salad. She looked at me, her eyes glinting with a calculated cruelty. "Which means, Naomi, you need to move your art supplies out of there by tomorrow. The smell of oil paint is giving me a migraine, and frankly, it's not like those canvases are ever going to be worth more than the fabric they're painted on." "Lydia's right, Naomi," my mother added, not even looking up from her wine. "We need to think about the aesthetic of this house now. Having your unfinished projects cluttering up the common areas makes us look disorganized. Maybe you should focus on something practical, like the laundry. The pile in the mudroom is getting out of hand." I felt the familiar heat of shame rising in my chest, but I kept my head down. I was the one who had spent years maintaining this house, yet I was being treated like a squatter who owed them a debt I could never repay. The breaking point didn't come from a shout, it came from a delete button. 2 days later, I returned from a long shift at my sales job to find my easel snapped in half next to the trash bins. My portfolio, years of work, sketches of Eleanor's hands, landscapes of the garden we loved, was gone. "I needed the space for my new treadmill," Lydia said, leaning against the doorframe of the sunroom, scrolling through her phone. "I figured since you weren't selling anything, it was just trash anyway. Oh, and I posted a video of the cleanup on Facebook. Everyone agrees. A clean house is a productive house." I checked my phone. The video already had hundreds of views. Lydia had filmed herself tossing my sketches into a bin while laughing about clearing out the clutter. The comments were a sea of laughing emojis and about-time messages from people who only knew the version of me Lydia sold them. That night, I didn't cry. The tears had finally dried up, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I realized that if I stayed, they would eventually erase every part of me, until there was nothing left but a shadow. I sat on the floor of my tiny, cramped room, the one they had moved me into so Lydia could have a study, and opened my laptop. For months, I had been quietly overperforming at my sales job, taking extra commissions and working through my lunch breaks. My family thought I was just drifting on the computer. They didn't know I was building a cage break fund. I searched for the most affordable, most inconspicuous one-room apartment in the city. I didn't need luxury. I needed a door with a lock that they didn't have a key to. When I found it, a gray fourth-floor walk-up with a single window, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years: control. I filled out the application with a steady hand. My deposit was paid by midnight. I began to pack in secret, one hoodie at a time, one hidden ledger at a time. I was leaving the mansion, leaving the inheritance they were so proud of, and leaving the memory of my grandmother in their careless hands. I thought I was walking away from my future. I had no idea I was actually walking toward a secret Eleanor had left waiting for me in the one place my family would never think to look. The key turned in the lock with a metallic click that sounded, for the first time in my life, like a victory. My new sanctuary was a fourth-floor walk-up that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old bricks. It was barely 200 square feet. The radiator hissed like an angry cat, and the single window looked out over a narrow alleyway. To my mother or Lydia, this place would have been a prison cell. To me, it was a fortress. I dropped my last suitcase on the linoleum floor and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. The silence was absolute. No one was shouting for their laundry. No one was mocking my sketches. No one was measuring the walls for a renovation while I was still standing between them. For exactly 10 minutes, I allowed myself to breathe. Then, the vibration started. It wasn't a single buzz, it was a rhythmic, relentless stutter of notifications. My phone screen flickered in the dim light of the room, lighting up the peeling wallpaper. I picked it up, and my stomach dropped through the floor. Lydia had done it. The photo was a high-angle shot of me from that morning, captured as I struggled down the driveway of the estate with my bulging suitcases. I looked disheveled, my hair windswept, my face a mask of exhaustion, but it was the caption that drew the blood from my face. The trash finally took itself out. My ugly and unintelligent sister has officially moved into the gutter where her talents belong. Finally, the Whitfield estate is a failure-free zone. New chapter, success-only freeloader gone. I scrolled. The engagement was explosive. Lydia's math prodigy, Brand had built her a massive following of people who equated status with worth. About time. People like that just drain the family energy, one comment read. She looks like a mess. Good riddance, read another. And then, the one that broke my heart. A like from my mother Patricia, followed by a comment from my father. A house is for those who contribute. Glad the air is finally clear. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. They were making me the villain of a story I hadn't even finished writing. They were using my exit, the most painful sacrifice of my life, to gain social media clout. Lydia was currently in a house I had kept clean for years, sleeping in a room I had sanitized for a dying woman, while she called me a freeloader to thousands of strangers. A cold, calm sensation washed over me. It was a clarity I'd never known. I didn't type a rebuttal. I didn't post a photo of my new key. Instead, I did the unthinkable. I clicked like on Lydia's post. I liked every single comment that insulted my intelligence. I even replied to one of Lydia's friends with a simple smile emoji. I needed them to feel safe. I needed them to believe they had successfully erased me. I set my phone face down on the small wooden table. I had exactly enough money for 2 months of rent and basic groceries. My family thought I was drifting into obscurity, but they didn't know I was about to pour every ounce of my unintelligent focus into the sales work they had dismissed as a hobby. As I lay back on the thin mattress, watching the shadows of the alleyway dance on the ceiling, I realized something. My family was celebrating their new life in a mansion they assumed was theirs by right of birth. They were so busy counting likes and measuring rooms that they had forgotten to check the one thing that actually mattered. They hadn't heard from the lawyer yet. And in that silence, I found my power. I fell asleep to the sound of the radiator's hiss, unaware that in exactly 3 months, a single phone call would turn my one-room sanctuary into the headquarters of their undoing. Success is the loudest sound you can make without ever opening your mouth. For 3 months, the only world I knew was the 4 walls of my one-room apartment and the blue light of my laptop screen. My family had always called my computer time a hobby, a way to avoid the real world of equations and high-status degrees. They didn't realize that while they were busy playing house in a mansion they didn't own, I was building a digital empire. I lived on coffee, adrenaline, and the burning memory of that Facebook post. My arts and sales brain, the one Patricia called unfocused, was actually my greatest weapon. I understood people. I knew how to read the hesitation in a client's voice, how to frame a pitch so it felt like a solution rather than a sale, and how to create visuals that stopped a scroll. I wasn't just working, I was hunting. By the second month, my commissions weren't just covering my rent, they were doubling it. I would sit at my small wooden table, my fingers flying across the keys, closing deals with companies that didn't care about my sister's math trophies. They cared about my numbers. And my numbers were staggering. One rainy Tuesday, I hit a milestone that made my heart race. A luxury lifestyle brand signed a six-figure contract for a marketing campaign I'd designed from scratch. I stared at the confirmation email, the reflection of the dingy alleyway outside my window blurring as my eyes welled up. In that moment, I realized I had earned more in 90 days than Lydia's academic brilliance would likely bring in for years. But I didn't post about it. I didn't update my status or buy a celebratory dinner. I kept my digital footprint invisible. I stayed the failure they needed me to be. Occasionally, I would break my own rule and check Lydia's profile. It was a gallery of unearned luxury. There was my mother, posing with Eleanor's vintage tea set. There was Lydia, showing off a new designer bag, captioned, "Living the life I earned. No room for dead weight anymore." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. They were spending money they didn't have, living in a house they didn't own. All while the person they mocked was becoming the only one with actual liquid assets. I felt like a chess player who had moved her queen into position while her opponent was still bragging about capturing a pawn. I was financially free, emotionally hardened, and completely untethered from their toxicity. Then the 3-month mark hit. I was eating a simple bowl of pasta when my phone rang. It wasn't a family member. It was a local number I didn't recognize. I answered with my professional sales voice, expecting a client. "Is this Naomi Whitfield?" A deep, formal voice asked. "My name is Arthur Sterling. I was the legal counsel for your late grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield. I've been looking for you for some time, Naomi. We have a matter of extreme urgency regarding the estate." My fork hit the plate with a clatter. I thought the house went to my father. I managed to whisper. The lawyer's voice remained calm, but there was a hint of something, perhaps satisfaction in his tone. "Your grandmother was very specific, Naomi. She left instructions that were only to be carried out after a 90-day observation period. That period ended yesterday. I need you to come to my office immediately. And you might want to bring a locksmith." The game was over. The observation period was finished. And as I grabbed my coat, I realized that Eleanor's final gift wasn't just a house. It was the chance to watch the vultures finally realize they were just birds in a cage I now owned. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a life-altering revelation. A silence so heavy, you can hear the beat of your own heart against your ribs. I sat in Arthur Sterling's office, the walls lined with leather-bound books that looked far more permanent than the cardboard box life I'd been living. Across from me, Arthur adjusted his glasses and slid a thick manila folder across the mahogany desk. "I'll be blunt, Naomi," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Your grandmother knew exactly who her family was. She knew that if she revealed her intentions the day she died, they would have pressured you, gaslit you, or worse. She wanted them to show their true colors first." My hands were trembling as I opened the folder. The first page was a copy of the deed. I scanned the lines, my breath hitching when I saw my name printed in bold, undeniable ink. "She left a 90-day grace period," Arthur explained. "A test. If they had treated you with kindness, if they had shared the home with you as a family, she had a secondary clause ready. But she predicted they wouldn't. She told me, 'Arthur, they'll treat that house like a trophy, and Naomi like an intruder. Let them get comfortable in their pride. Then, give Naomi the keys to the kingdom.'" I looked at the date on the will. It had been signed 2 years ago, right around the time Lydia started her math competitions, and my parents started forgetting to take Eleanor to her appointments. Eleanor hadn't just been watching me massage her legs, she'd been writing a manifesto of justice. "The house was never theirs, Naomi," Arthur said, leaning forward. "It never belonged to your father, it's yours. Every brick, every antique, every square inch of that land. And because they've been living there without a lease or your permission for 3 months, they are technically trespassers." A strange, cold heat bloomed in my chest. I thought of the one-room apartment I'd been hiding in. I thought of the 450 likes on the post calling me a freeloader. I thought of my sketches being tossed into the trash like they were nothing. What do I do now? I whispered. Arthur reached into his drawer and pulled out a set of brass keys and a stack of legal notices. Now you decide what kind of landlord you want to be. I've already drafted the notice to vacate and the alternative, a market-rate lease agreement. But according to Eleanor's final letter, she suggested you start with a surprise visit. I took the keys. They felt heavy, cold, and powerful. For 3 months, I had been the ugly, unintelligent failure living in a gutter. My family was currently at the estate, probably planning a summer party to show off their new wealth to the neighbors. They had no idea that the freeloader was about to come home. I stood up, my spine straighter than it had been in years. The sales brain they mocked was already running the numbers. I wasn't just going back to claim a house, I was going back to reclaim my name. Mr. Sterling, I said, tucking the deed into my bag. Do you know a good locksmith who works on short notice? He offered a rare, thin smile. I already have one on standby, Naomi. How soon do you want to arrive? Now, I replied. I want to see the look on Lydia's face when she realizes she's been bragging about living in my guest room. I walked out of the office and into the bright afternoon sun, heading toward the mansion. The family was about to receive a legal bomb, and I was the one holding the fuse. The gravel of the driveway crunched under my tires, a sound that used to signal my return to a place of service, but today it sounded like an arrival. I stood before the massive oak doors of Eleanor's estate, the legal folder tucked under my arm like a shield. Beside me stood the locksmith, his heavy tool bag clinking, a metallic funeral bell for my family's delusions. I didn't knock. I didn't have to. I turned the brass key Arthur had given me, and the door swung open to the sound of laughter. In the dining room, my parents and Lydia were seated around Eleanor's mahogany table, surrounded by expensive shopping bags. They were celebrating something, likely another achievement of Lydia's that I wasn't supposed to understand. When they saw me, the laughter died instantly, replaced by a cold, sharpened edge. Naomi? My mother, Patricia, gasped, her wine glass freezing halfway to her lips. What on earth are you doing here? You don't just walk in anymore. You're a guest, and an uninvited one at that. Actually, Mom, I said, my voice steady and low, I'm not a guest. Lydia stood up, her face twisting into that familiar mask of academic superiority. Did the gutter get too cold for you? We already told you the freeloader era is over. Dad, tell her to leave before I call the police for trespassing. My father, Harold, cleared his throat, leaning back with the unearned confidence of a man who thought he owned the world. Naomi, don't make this embarrassing. You moved out. You made your choice. This house belongs to the heads of this family now. I didn't argue. I simply walked to the table and laid the manila folder open in front of him. I watched his eyes scan the bold text of the deed, then the stamped certification from the county office, and finally the letter from Arthur Sterling. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the color drain from his face, turning a sickly shade of gray. What is this? He whispered, his hands beginning to shake. It's a deed, I replied. Grandma Eleanor left the house to me. Everything. The land, the furniture, the air you're breathing. It's been mine for 3 months. And these? I pulled out 3 sets of documents. These are your options. You can sign these market-rate leases and pay me rent for the time you've already spent here. Or you can vacate by the end of the week. You're lying, Lydia shrieked, snatching the papers. Her eyes darted across the legal jargon, her math prodigy brain finally hitting a variable it couldn't solve. This is impossible. You're the failure. You're the one who lived in a 1-room apartment. I lived there because you made this house a hell, I said, looking her directly in the eye. And while you were posting about me on Facebook, I was waiting for the lawyer to finish the observation period, Grandma said in her will. She wanted to see if you'd be a family. You chose to be vultures. The transition was instantaneous. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a frantic, desperate energy. My mother was suddenly around the table, her hand on my arm, her voice shifting into a high-pitched, watery plea. Naomi, honey, we didn't mean those things. It was just a stressful time. We're family. You wouldn't really charge your own parents' rent, would you? You wouldn't throw us out? Lydia's face crumpled. The girl who had mocked my unintelligence to thousands was now sobbing, reaching for my hand. Naomi, please. I have an image to maintain. If people find out I'm just a tenant, if they find out you own this, I'll be ruined. I looked at them, the people who had celebrated my homelessness, and felt a strange sense of detachment. They weren't apologizing for hurting me, they were apologizing for getting caught. You have 24 hours to decide, I said, stepping back from their reach. But I should warn you, I've already instructed the locksmith to change the exterior codes. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, my father called out a name that stopped me cold. A name that suggested they still had one card left to play. Power doesn't always feel like a celebration. Sometimes it feels like a heavy, cold clarity. As I stood in the center of Eleanor's grand foyer, watching my parents and Lydia scramble to justify their existence in a house they had already mentally sold, I realized something that no amount of money could fix. This house wasn't a home anymore. It was a museum of every insult I'd ever endured, and the air inside was thick with the rot of their entitlement. "We can make this work, Naomi," my father said, his voice now a desperate, oily pitch. "We'll pay the rent. We'll even pay back rent. Just don't make us leave. Think of the neighbors. Think of the scandal if people find out we're renting from you." Lydia was sitting on her designer luggage, her face blotchy from crying. She wasn't crying because she missed Eleanor. She was crying because the Whitfield estate was the only thing giving her social media profile any value. "I'll delete the post," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll tell everyone it was a joke. Just let me keep the library, Naomi. I have a prestigious math fellowship interview next week. I can't do that from a rental." I looked at them. The math prodigy who couldn't subtract her ego from reality, and the parents who only saw my value when it came with a deed. For years, I had massaged Eleanor's legs in these rooms, hoping that one day my family would see me. Now they were looking right at me, and all I felt was an overwhelming urge to be anywhere else. "I'm not charging you rent," I said, my voice echoing through the hallway. A flash of hope lit up Patricia's face. "Oh, thank goodness. I knew you were a good girl, Naomi." "I'm selling the house," I interrupted. The silence that followed was absolute. "You can't," my mother breathed, her hand flying to her throat. "This is our legacy. This house is worth a fortune. It's worth $589,000 according to the appraisal," I said, leaning against the mahogany banister. "And I've already listed it. The first viewing is tomorrow morning. Since you haven't signed a lease, you have 48 hours to get your things out before the staging team arrives." The next 2 days were a blur of chaotic energy. I watched as the Whitfield prestige was packed into cardboard boxes. I watched my father drag that mahogany table, the one he'd so carefully appraised, out to a moving truck that was headed back to a cramped 3-bedroom rental on the other side of town. Lydia was the last one to leave. She stood by the front door, her phone in her hand, looking at the viral freeloader post one last time before she finally hit delete. But the damage was done. The internet is forever. And the gutter she had mocked me for living in was now her own reality. As the moving truck pulled away, leaving the driveway empty for the first time in months, I walked back inside. The house felt massive. Cold. It was a $589,000 prize that I didn't want to keep. I realized that keeping this house would mean keeping the ghosts of their cruelty alive. To truly move forward, I had to burn the bridge entirely. I took one last look at the sunroom where my art had been called clutter. Tomorrow, a stranger would walk in and see a potential yoga studio or an office. But I saw a fresh start. The check for the sale was already being processed. But as I turned the key for the final time, I got a notification on my phone. Not from Facebook, but from a bank alert. My sales business had just hit a new peak, and I realized I wasn't just walking away with the house money. I was walking away with $1 million future and a final, crushing lesson for the family I was leaving behind. They say money can't buy happiness, but as I stood on the balcony of my new $240,000 duplex, watching the sunset dip below a horizon that finally felt like mine, I realized that money certainly buys the silence necessary to find it. The air here didn't smell like eucalyptus ointment or the stagnant rot of resentment. It smelled like fresh paint, expensive jasmine, and the future. After the sale of Eleanor's estate was finalized and the $589,000 check cleared, I didn't rush out to buy designer bags or luxury cars. I didn't need a status symbol to prove my worth. I needed a foundation. I invested the remaining $349,000 into the one thing my family had called a distraction: my sales and art curation business. In the 3 months since I'd moved into my one-room sanctuary, I had learned how to turn a no into a yes and a sketch into a brand. With the capital from the house, I scaled. I hired a team that respected my artsy brain and built a platform that connected independent creators with high-end investors. Within a year, the unintelligent sister was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar agency. One evening, while sitting in my home office, a room 3 times the size of that first apartment, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from a burner account I'd forgotten to delete. It was Lydia. I hadn't checked her profile in months. Curious, I clicked. The math prodigy was no longer posting from marble kitchens or manicured gardens. The latest photo showed her in a cramped, dimly lit kitchen with mismatched cabinets, the rental house they'd been forced back into. Her hair was unkempt, and the brilliance in her eyes had been replaced by a hollow, frantic desperation. The caption read, "Life is so unfair. Some people just get lucky while the real geniuses have to struggle. Burned out, family betrayal." I scrolled down to the comments. The 1,450 likes she used to get had dwindled to barely 20. People had moved on. The freeloader narrative she had built her identity on had collapsed the moment the truth came out about who actually owned the estate. My mother had commented, asking if Lydia could help with the electricity bill this month, to which Lydia hadn't replied. They were still in the gutter they had tried to build for me. I looked at the freeloader post one last time, the one where I was captured looking small and defeated in the driveway. I realized I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't even feel the need for them to see my new duplex or my bank balance. I hit the block button on Lydia's profile, then my mother's, then my father's. I watched their names disappear from my digital world, a final, clean severance of the cord that had been strangling me for 28 years. I wasn't the invisible daughter, the failure, or the nurse. I was Naomi Whitfield, and I had finally solved the only equation that mattered. My peace was worth more than their validation. I put my phone down and walked back to my easel. I began to paint a portrait of Eleanor, not as a sick woman, but as the silent strategist who had known all along that her invisible granddaughter was the strongest of them all. My story with them was over. But as I picked up my brush, I realized that for the first time in my life, the canvas was completely, beautifully blank.